She could not feed herself. She could not hold a coherent conversation. The disease had spent years physically destroying the structures of her brain, the tissue responsible for memory, for language, for personality, eroded beyond any hope of recovery. One day earlier, she had not even remembered that she had a daughter at all. Then, on her final day, she looked up, her eyes focused, and she began to speak, clearly, coherently, in complete sentences. She recognized her daughter. She remembered their shared life. For a few precious minutes, the woman her family had lost years before returned completely, intact, present, herself. And then she died. What happened in those final minutes has a name. It is called terminal lucidity, and it is one of the most documented and least explained phenomena in all of end-of-life medicine. Here is why it matters so profoundly. The standard model of neuroscience holds that memory and personality are physically stored in the structures of the brain. When those structures are destroyed, as they demonstrably are in advanced dementia, confirmed by brain scans and by autopsy, the memory and the personality they contained should be gone, permanently. There should be nothing left to produce them. And yet, again and again, in the final hours of life, they return. How? How does a brain that has been physically devastated suddenly produce coherent memory, clear personality, and full recognition, and then, almost immediately afterward, stop forever? This is not a fringe claim. It is documented by hospice workers, recorded by physicians, and currently being studied by researchers at NYU and the University of Pennsylvania, with funding from the National Institutes of Health. And it points toward a question that sits at the very heart of consciousness science. What terminal lucidity is? Terminal lucidity is defined as a sudden, unexpected return of mental clarity and memory shortly before death, typically in patients whose cognitive faculties had been severely and apparently irreversibly impaired. The phenomenon goes by several names. Some clinicians call it the end-of-life rally. Hospice workers sometimes call it the surge. The medical literature increasingly uses the more precise terms terminal lucidity and paradoxical lucidity, which we will distinguish shortly. Whatever the name, the core observation is consistent. A patient who has lost the ability to communicate, to recognize loved ones, or to engage with the world, usually due to advanced dementia, but sometimes due to brain tumors, strokes, or other severe neurological conditions, unexpectedly regains those abilities in the days, hours, or sometimes minutes before death. The return can be partial or remarkably complete. In the strongest cases, a patient who has been non-verbal for months or years suddenly speaks in full, coherent sentences. A patient who has not recognized family members in years suddenly knows them by name, recalls shared memories, and engages in genuine emotional connection. The personality that the disease appeared to have erased returns, intact, as if it had been waiting somewhere all along. And then, typically within hours to days, the patient dies. This timing is part of what makes the phenomenon so significant and so poignant. For families, the lucid episode is often misread as a sign of recovery. Their loved one seems to be getting better. Hope returns, and then, almost cruelly, death follows quickly. Experienced hospice workers have learned to recognize the surge for what it usually is, not a recovery, but a farewell. The frequency of the phenomenon appears to be higher than most people realize. In one study of family caregivers of people with severe dementia, all 8 of the caregivers whose family members had already died reported witnessing a lucid episode before death. While this is a small sample, it suggests that terminal lucidity may be far more common than its limited scientific attention would imply. a phenomenon hiding in plain sight, witnessed by countless families but rarely studied with rigour. The documented cases. Accounts of unexpected clarity near death are not new. They appear throughout the older medical literature, stretching back centuries. 19th century physicians noted these episodes regularly, often as diagnostic signs. One Victorian medical text observed that in a dying patient, delirium may briefly cease and the mind become clear, only to be followed swiftly by physical collapse and death. For much of medical history, these observations were recorded as clinical curiosities, noted but not investigated, not explained, and not connected to any larger understanding of the mind. The modern scientific investigation of terminal lucidity owes much to the work of biologist Michael Nahm, who coined the modern term in 2009 and, together with researchers including Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia, began the systematic collection and analysis of cases that moved the phenomenon from anecdote to coordinated science. The cases they documented are striking in their specificity. There are accounts of patients with advanced Alzheimer's disease, patients who had not spoken meaningfully in years, who, in their final hours, asked for specific family members by name, expressed clear and appropriate emotions about their impending death, and said goodbye with full awareness of what was happening. There are accounts of patients with brain tumours so large that the physical destruction of brain tissue was extensive and documented. Patients who nonetheless experienced periods of complete mental clarity before death. There are accounts of patients with severe chronic psychiatric conditions, schizophrenia, profound developmental disabilities, who, in the period before death, displayed a clarity, calmness, and coherence that they had not shown at any point in their adult lives. One historically documented category is particularly difficult to explain: cases in which the lucidity included knowledge or awareness that the patient could not plausibly have acquired in their impaired state. Patients who became aware of events happening elsewhere. Patients who spoke of deceased relatives as if perceiving them. Patients whose final lucid words suggested an awareness of their situation, more complete than their devastated brains should have been able to generate. The most important feature across all these cases is the relationship to the physical state of the brain. In dementia, and in brain tumour cases especially, the physical deterioration of the brain is not in question. It is measurable. It is visible on imaging. It is confirmed at autopsy. These are not cases where the brain was secretly intact. These are cases where the brain was demonstrably, physically damaged, and clarity returned anyway. Terminal versus paradoxical lucidity. As the scientific study of the phenomenon has matured, researchers have developed more precise terminology, and the distinction is worth understanding because it points toward how science is trying to get a measurable grip on something deeply elusive. Terminal lucidity, in the strictest definition, refers specifically to episodes of returned clarity that occur shortly before death, typically within hours to days, and that are followed by death. Paradoxical lucidity is the broader term. It refers to any unexpected episode of returned clarity in a person assumed to have lost such capacities due to progressive neurodegeneration, regardless of whether the person dies shortly afterward. Some patients experience these episodes and then survive for weeks or even months. The paradox is that a person with an irreversible, progressive brain disease suddenly gets better, even temporarily when the disease should make that impossible. Researchers debate the exact relationship between the two terms. Some argue terminal lucidity is a distinct phenomenon. Others argue it is simply a subtype of paradoxical lucidity, the cases that happen to occur right at the end of life. This may sound like a technical distinction, But it matters scientifically, because defining the phenomenon precisely is the first step toward measuring it, predicting it, and ultimately explaining it. This is exactly what is happening now. A study by NYU Langone Health, in collaboration with the National Institute on Aging, began in 2022 and aims to establish reliable methods for measuring episodes of lucidity in people with severe end-stage dementia. The University of Pennsylvania's program on precision medicine for the brain is running several projects in partnership with the Alzheimer's Association, the CDC, and the National Institute on Aging. This is significant. It means terminal lucidity is no longer being treated as a collection of touching anecdotes. It is being treated as a real, measurable neurological phenomenon worthy of serious, funded, multi-institutional scientific investigation. The medical establishment, slowly, is beginning to take it seriously. The reason it is taking it seriously is that the phenomenon, if understood, could reveal something profound, not just about death, but about the nature of memory itself. If memories thought to be destroyed can return, then perhaps they were never destroyed. Perhaps they were only inaccessible. And that possibility has enormous implications, both for dementia treatment and for our understanding of where memory actually resides. The competing explanations. So what causes terminal lucidity? There are several competing explanations, and intellectual honesty requires examining all of them. The first set of explanations is biological, and these are the explanations most mainstream researchers favour. One hypothesis comes from Dr. Jimo Boyagin, whose research on the dying brain we examined in the previous video. She suggests that terminal lucidity may be due to last-ditch efforts of the brain to preserve itself as its physiological systems fail. The dying brain, under extreme stress, may release a surge of neurotransmitters and electrical activity, the same gamma wave surge documented at the moment of death, that temporarily produces heightened function. A related hypothesis comes from Dr. Sam Parnia, the critical care physician at NYU who has spent his career studying death and resuscitation. Parnia proposes that as the dying brain is deprived of oxygen, it loses its normal suppression mechanisms. The brakes that, in ordinary life, keep us focused on individual tasks by filtering out the vast majority of the brain's potential activity. When those brakes come off, Parnia suggests, the dying person may suddenly gain access to parts of their brain and their memory that they normally cannot reach. These biological explanations are plausible and important. They represent the kind of mechanistic hypotheses that good science generates and tests. But here is the honest difficulty they face. In advanced dementia, the problem is not merely that memory is suppressed or inaccessible. The problem is that the physical tissue that stores and processes memory has been destroyed. Neurons have died. Synaptic connections have been physically eliminated. The brain has, in many cases, visibly shrunk. A surge of neurotransmitters, or the release of inhibitory brakes, can increase activity in surviving tissue. But it cannot restore function to tissue that no longer exists. If the memory structures are physically gone, no amount of electrical surging should be able to retrieve a coherent, specific personal memory from them. And yet, in the strongest cases, that is precisely what appears to happen. This is why terminal lucidity sits at the edge of what current neuroscience can explain. The biological hypotheses account for the energy of the phenomenon, the surge of activity. What they struggle to account for is the content, the return of specific, coherent memory and personality from a brain that should no longer contain the means to produce it. And this is where the phenomenon connects to the larger questions of this series. If memory and personality can return when their physical substrate has been destroyed, It raises the same possibility suggested by Van Lommel's cardiac arrest research, by the children's past life cases, by every line of evidence we have examined, that memory and consciousness may not be stored in the brain in the simple way the materialist model assumes, that the brain may be more like an interface, a receiver and transmitter, than a hard drive, and that when the interface fails, what it was accessing may not be as gone as it appears. Part 5. What it means. Let us be careful and honest about what terminal lucidity does and does not establish. It does not prove that consciousness survives death. It does not prove the existence of a soul. It is entirely possible that future neuroscience will discover a complete biological mechanism that explains how a damaged brain can produce a final burst of coherent function. The research at NYU and the University of Pennsylvania may yet find exactly such a mechanism. Good science remains open to that possibility, but terminal lucidity does establish something important right now, regardless of which explanation ultimately prevails. It establishes that the relationship between the physical brain and conscious experience is more complex and more surprising than the simple materialist model suggests. The straightforward equation, brain tissue equals memory, destroyed tissue equals lost memory permanently, is too simple to account for what hospice workers and physicians actually observe at the bedsides of the dying. There is also something here that transcends the scientific question entirely, something about human meaning. For families, terminal lucidity is often the most precious experience of the entire long ordeal of a loved one's dementia. After years of watching someone they love disappear by degrees, after the grief of being forgotten by a person who is still alive, after saying goodbye to someone who no longer knows them, they are given, in the final hours, a moment of return, a final conversation, a last recognition, a genuine goodbye from the person they thought was already gone. Whatever the ultimate biological or non-biological explanation turns out to be, this much is real and documented. The personality that dementia appears to erase is not always as erased as it seems. Something of the person remains, accessible in those final hours, in a way that the long middle years of the disease suggested was impossible. And that fact alone, that the self can return when everything suggested it was destroyed, is one of the most quietly profound observations in all of end-of-life medicine. It suggests that the person we are is more resilient, more persistent, and perhaps more fundamental than the deterioration of the brain would lead us to believe. 10 videos into this series now, we have examined consciousness from the laboratory, the operating room, the intelligence archive, the ancient temple, and now the hospice bedside, the place where, for every one of us, this question eventually becomes personal. Terminal lucidity does not give us a final answer, but it gives us something arguably more valuable, a clear, documented, undeniable observation that the standard story we have been told about the mind is incomplete, that memory and personality, thought to be destroyed, can return, that the self can resurface from what looked like total ruin. Across this entire series, the same pattern has emerged again and again, from completely independent directions. Consciousness persisting when the brain has stopped, awareness reaching beyond the physical senses, memory surviving where its physical substrate has been destroyed, identity returning from apparent oblivion. None of it proves any single metaphysical conclusion. All of it points in the same direction, toward a mind that is larger, more persistent, and more mysterious than the materialist model has ever been able to contain. Terminal lucidity is, in a sense, the most intimate of all these phenomena. because it is the one most of us will encounter directly. At the bedside of someone we love, in those final, precious, inexplicable moments when the person we thought we had lost looks up and knows us and says goodbye. That moment is real, it is documented, and science is only beginning to understand what it means. If this honest exploration of life's deepest questions is what you value, subscribe and stay with us. The investigation continues next week. I will see you there.